There's a feeling that creeps in quietly, never loud, never demanding. It arrives between tasks, in the stillness after a long day, or in the morning silence before the world starts speaking again. A sense that something inside you is changing, or maybe has already changed. You don't dislike who you are. This isn't rebellion, this is recognition, a subtle shift in your center, telling you you're ready to let go of versions of yourself that no longer feel quite real. The roles you played, the expectations you followed, the masks you wore not out of dishonesty, but survival, growth. And in that moment, brief maybe, but honest, you wonder what would it mean to begin again, not in a dramatic way, not by burning everything down, but by quietly, purposefully, returning to yourself. It's here that the Stoics would meet you, not with fanfare, but with stillness. If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid, Epictetus once said. Reinvention to them wasn't a performance. It was a turning inward, then moving forward. And if that quiet pull toward something more intentional has found you lately, this journey is for you. By the way, if you find calm in this kind of reflection, this gentle, honest exploration of self, it would mean a lot if you subscribe to the channel. Not for hype or algorithms, but so we can keep walking this path together. Because this isn't about escaping who you are. It's about returning to what's always been real and choosing what comes next. You're not late. You're just listening more closely now. You begin. Not by adding, but by subtracting. Before you can become someone new, you need to face who you've been carrying, not just in name or job title, but in thought patterns, assumptions, and quiet compulsions that whisper who you're supposed to be. You can't move forward if the old self is still driving with a firm grip on the wheel. This is where the Stoics started. They didn't chase transformation by adding more. They stripped away what didn't belong. You sit quietly and ask yourself, what fills my mind that doesn't serve me anymore? Worries about things you cannot change. Regrets for decisions already made. Roles you never questioned but always played. Opinions you inherited without reflection. Desires that were never your own. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, whose days were filled with more pressure than most of us will ever know, still found time every morning and every night to write in his journal, not to boast, but to clear the clutter. His meditations weren't written for us. They were private. They were his attempt to stay honest with himself. He once wrote, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it, and this you have the power to revoke at any moment." That's a hard truth, but also a liberating one. You may not control your circumstances, but you can edit your interpretation. And in doing so, you begin to cut away at the noise. You begin to see the truth hiding underneath all the mental commentary. Picture your inner life like a cluttered room. Papers stacked, old items pushed into corners, things you once needed but no longer do. The Stoics aren't asking you to throw everything out, but they are asking, what are you still holding that no longer holds you? Maybe it's the idea that success needs to look a certain way. Maybe it's shame you never examined. Maybe it's an old fear of disappointing someone who no longer even watches your life unfold. Letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It means honoring that some things served their purpose and releasing them with gratitude. You start by noticing when your mind spins on autopilot, noticing when you react from fear rather than thought, noticing how much of your day is filled with inputs, news, commentary, status updates, and how little space remains for reflection. So you begin to clear. You limit your exposure to mental junk food. You start saying no, not with resentment, but with awareness. You catch yourself when you're performing instead of living. And with each layer removed, you feel a little lighter. The Stoics called this process patheia, not indifference as some misunderstand it, but inner calm, unshaken by every tug of emotion or whim of the day. You realize Peace doesn't come from more. It comes from less noise, like the ocean after a storm. Still powerful, but steady, like a room with only what matters, like a mind not empty but quiet enough to listen. And so you ask, what could I hear? If I stopped trying to speak over the silence, what would remain? If I stopped clinging to every passing thought, you're not erasing yourself. You're just wiping the glass clean so you can see who you really are underneath it all. This is where reinvention begins. Not with effort, but with clarity. Let that be your first act, not becoming someone new, but removing what's in the way of who you've always quietly been. Now that the noise has softened, you begin to hear something underneath. Not a voice, not instructions, but a kind of signal, faint, consistent, true. It isn't telling you what to do, it's asking you what you believe. Because reinvention without direction is just spinning. You don't need a detailed map of who to become, but you do need a compass, something steady enough to point you forward even when the path gets unclear. The Stoics were architects of this kind of direction. They didn't chase goals in the way we're taught to. They focused on virtues, 4 of them specifically: wisdom, courage, temperance, justice. These weren't ideals to admire. They were tools, living guides for how to respond, how to lead, how to fall and rise, and remain whole. Marcus Aurelius, again writing only to himself, once said, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one, not decide, not research. Be." So you pause here, not to act, but to reflect. You ask, what do I stand for when no one is watching? What do I return to when I'm tired or tested? These are not easy questions, but they're necessary ones. Let's begin with wisdom, not intelligence, not facts. Wisdom, the calm ability to know what matters and what doesn't, to discern truth from noise, to respond, not react, to be teachable and humble enough to learn always. Do you allow yourself space to listen? Are you open to being wrong? Do you seek understanding or validation? Then there's courage, not bold declarations, but quiet steadiness. The courage to speak truth when it's inconvenient, to endure pain without complaint, to risk becoming someone new, even if it means being misunderstood for a while. Courage doesn't mean you never feel afraid. It means you don't run when fear shows up. Next is temperance, the forgotten virtue in our age of extremes. It's not suppression, it's balance. The art of restraint, knowing that just because something is available doesn't mean it's beneficial. That self-control is not a punishment, it's power. You consider how often you chase more stimulation, more attention, more indulgence, and you ask quietly, what would happen if I didn't? And then justice, the virtue that pulls you beyond yourself. Not just fairness, but service, seeing yourself as part of something greater, treating others not as tools, but as fellow travelers, speaking up when needed, standing firm for the voiceless, even when it's inconvenient. Justice is how you extend your inner transformation into the outer world. These virtues aren't slogans, they're practices, and they begin with choice. You don't need to be perfect at them. The Stoics weren't either, but they returned to them daily, repeatedly, like prayer, like breathing. You imagine your life like a ship in open water. The storm will come, waves will crash. But these 4 principles, they are your anchor, your rudder, your quiet North Star. You don't need a 10-year plan. You need a present-day principle, so you sit with them. You don't memorize, you internalize. And then, gently, you make your own. Maybe your compass adds another word, patience, or truth, or dignity. That's okay. Stoicism isn't a cage, it's a framework. What matters is that your values are chosen, not inherited by accident or absorbed by habit. You choose what defines you now, and when doubt visits, because it will, you come back to this compass. When success tempts your ego, you ask, is this still aligned with justice? When fear urges you to shrink, you whisper, can I move with courage? When chaos clouds your judgment, you breathe. Let me return to wisdom. This isn't performative, it's foundational. You are not inventing a new personality. You are revealing an inner code. that can outlast changing moods, external chaos, and public opinion. It's not about doing the right thing once. It's about becoming the kind of person who naturally does it without fanfare. So you ask yourself again and again, what kind of soul do I want to sculpt here, not for applause, not for approval, but for peace? Because when the world pulls at you from every direction, you will be pulled toward the center you have chosen. That is how you walk through change without losing yourself. You've named your principles. They feel real now, anchored in something solid. But almost immediately, something tugs at you. Life doesn't get easier just because you've decided to live with intention. People still disappoint you. Situations still spiral. Plans still fall apart. You're reminded quickly life doesn't bend to your will, and it never promised to. This is the moment when most people give up on reinventing themselves. They think, if I can't control what happens, what's the point of trying? But the Stoics would smile at that question, not in mockery, but in understanding, because that thought is precisely the doorway to real freedom. You remember Epictetus, a man born into slavery, later crippled, and yet one of the most unshakable thinkers of his time. He wrote, "Some things are up to us, and some things are not." That sentence so simple splits the world in two, and your job, your freedom, your power is to live in the right half. You start by noticing how often your mind spins around things it cannot change. Other people's opinions, the outcome of your effort, how fast results come, whether someone likes you, the past. The Stoics taught this suffering often begins not in what happens, but in your insistence that it should have been different. So you begin the hard but beautiful practice of detachment. Not apathy, not laziness, but focused effort only in places where your effort has meaning. You cannot make the world treat you fairly, but you can act with justice. You cannot guarantee success, but you can show up fully. You cannot force someone to understand you, but you can choose to speak with clarity and calm. This shift isn't dramatic. It's not some thunderclap revelation. It's gradual, humble, like walking into a quiet forest. After hours of traffic, you find the freedom to say, "This is not mine to carry," and you let it go. Think of a mountain stream. It doesn't resist the boulder in its path. It simply moves around it, continuing forward. That's the spirit of detachment. Not weakness, not retreat, but adaptation. Your energy is not infinite, so why spend it on battles that were never yours? You now start to track your thoughts, not obsessively, but curiously. When something frustrates you, you pause. Is this within my control? If yes, act. If no, release. You may do this 10, 20, 100 times a day. That's okay. It's not failure, it's training. The Stoics were never seeking perfection. They were practicing resilience. This is where you begin to notice peace growing, not because life is easier, but because your mind isn't fighting everything all the time. You realize the external world is unpredictable, but your response, that's yours. You also begin to shift how you define progress. You stop asking, did things go the way I wanted? And instead ask, did I respond with strength, clarity, and calm? This redefinition is subtle, but it changes everything. You stop chasing outcomes. You start embodying values. This detachment makes you strangely powerful, not because you dominate, but because you cannot be dominated. Insults lose their sting. Failures lose their shame. Praise loses its grip. You aren't trying to win anymore. You're trying to stay centered, and that makes you rare. You become like the archer the Stoics spoke of. You draw your bow, you aim with care, you practice your skill. But once the arrow leaves your fingers, you release it in peace. The wind may shift, the target may move, but your part is done. You did what you could. That is enough. So you live with intention, you act with care, and you accept gently that results belong to the world, not to you. This is the paradox of Stoic detachment. When you stop needing to control everything, you begin to control yourself. and that you realize is the only real power worth having. There's something you've probably sensed by now. Reinvention isn't comfortable, not the quiet, reflective kind, the Stoic kind, the kind that doesn't rely on flashy affirmations or fast results, the kind that asks you to face discomfort, not as a temporary inconvenience, but as a teacher. You begin to feel it the moment you try to change a habit. You want to rise earlier, speak more honestly, spend your time with more care, but your body resists. Your mind pushes back. This is hard, it whispers. Why bother? But discomfort isn't a sign you're failing. It's a sign you're doing something real. The Stoics understood this deeply. They didn't believe growth came through ease. They believed it came through voluntary hardship, chosen struggle, practiced resistance, honest friction. Seneca, a wealthy Roman senator who nonetheless practiced going without once, wrote, "It is not that we are given a short life, but we make it short by wasting time. Life is long if you know how to use it." He also advised his students to sleep on hard beds, eat plain food, walk through cold air, not to suffer unnecessarily, but to build the muscle of resilience. Because if you only train in comfort, life will break you with its first real test. So you begin to shift your relationship with discomfort. You stop seeing it as a problem. You start seeing it as proof that you're on the edge of growth. When your legs burn in a difficult workout, when silence stretches in a conversation where you once filled every gap, when you speak a truth you used to bury, and your voice shakes just a little. Each of these moments becomes a doorway, not dramatic, but meaningful. You realize that every version of your future self, the calmer one, the more honest one, the more grounded one already exists. But you must pass through these moments of resistance to reach them. Think of nature. The seed must split to become the tree. The caterpillar must dissolve into unrecognizable soup to emerge as something winged. The river must endure rock after rock to carve the canyon. Why should your becoming be any different? But modern life teaches avoidance. Pain is bad. Fast is better. If you're uncomfortable, something's wrong. Stoicism whispers the opposite. Discomfort, when chosen wisely, is growth in disguise. So you experiment. You begin saying no when you usually say yes just to stay liked. You sit with boredom instead of scrolling. You take a cold shower not for toughness, but to prove to yourself I can do difficult things calmly. These aren't heroic gestures, they're subtle rewiring, reclaiming agency one choice at a time. And when the uninvited discomfort comes, as it always does, you find yourself more prepared. You lose something you cared about. You're misunderstood. You face rejection, illness, failure. The pain still comes, but you don't crumble because you've trained. You've met discomfort before on your own terms. You've sat with it, learned from it. You've stopped running. You now recognize that what makes discomfort unbearable isn't always the pain itself, but your resistance to it. You no longer ask, how do I avoid pain? You ask, how can I move through this with dignity? This shift is quiet, but radical. It changes how you hold your suffering. It allows you to breathe inside the storm, to stay kind in the face of frustration, to act with principle, even when scared. You no longer fear pain as a sign you're doing something wrong. You start to see it as evidence you are in the fire where old selves are melted and new selves are forged. This doesn't mean you become rigid or cold. In fact, the opposite. You become warmer, more empathetic, because once you've sat with your own discomfort without fleeing, you understand what others are carrying, and you meet them, not with judgment, but presence. This is the paradox. By choosing a little discomfort now, you free yourself from much greater suffering later. Avoidance builds weakness, confrontation builds strength, but grace is the key. You don't push through pain with clenched fists. You walk through it with soft awareness, with respect, with curiosity. What is this discomfort trying to teach me? You don't always get answers, but you get stronger, wiser, quieter, inside. And in that quiet, you hear something else. You are no longer afraid of hard things. You've faced them, chosen them, befriended them, and in doing so, you've become someone you once admired from afar. You've begun to see discomfort not as the enemy, but as a necessary companion in your evolution. And yet, even now, something tugs at you from another direction, time itself. Your mind, like most minds, drifts. It plays reruns of past mistakes. It imagines outcomes that haven't happened. It builds stories of who you should be by next month, next year, someday. You want to reinvent yourself, but you keep getting pulled into timelines that don't actually exist. The Stoics understood this trap, and they offered a powerful, freeing antidote: presence. Marcus Aurelius once reminded himself in his journal, "Never let the future disturb you. You will meet it, if you have to, with the same weapons of reason, which today arm you against the present." He was the emperor of Rome, surrounded by chaos, demands, politics, war, and still he returned again and again to the simple discipline of now. So you begin to explore this. What does it feel like to actually be here, not planning, not remembering, just here? You begin to notice the texture of your days, the sound of your breath, when you're not rushing, the way your body tenses, when you think about something that hasn't even happened, the endless tabs open in your head, each fighting for your focus. And you wonder, how much of my life have I lived without truly living it? This isn't about perfection. You're not trying to float in a Zen state while emails pile up. You're trying to reclaim the ability to attend to what's in front of you, because that's the only place your power actually lives. The Stoics taught that the past is unreachable, and the future is unknowable, and that everything you do, every change you make, happens in this single present moment. So you begin to practice. You choose one activity today to do without distraction: washing dishes, eating lunch, walking outside. You don't make it mystical. You just observe your thoughts, your breath, the sensations. You bring your mind back gently, like leading a child away from a busy street. This is not glamorous work, but it is powerful. Each time you return to the present, you take back a little energy from your regrets, a little anxiety from your fears. You stop bleeding attention into futures that haven't arrived, pasts that won't return. You begin to trust that whatever comes, you'll meet it with the presence and preparation of the person you are becoming. Imagine standing at the edge of a river. You can't stop the water from flowing, but you can choose to step fully into the stream, to feel it, to move with it. That's presence. Not freezing time, but meeting time as it is. You also start to see how being present helps with all the other parts of your reinvention. Presence allows you to notice when your old habits creep in. Presence gives you space before you react. Presence makes room for joy. Real joy, not the kind you chase, but the kind you notice. It's in the way sunlight hits your face through the window, in the laughter you almost missed while checking your phone, in the brief silence between two people who don't need to fill it. You understand now reinvention doesn't just happen in grand decisions. It happens in small moments of alignment. And you don't need to wait to feel ready. You don't need the stars to align. You only need to be here one moment at a time. That's how you build the kind of presence that holds up when things get messy, when plans change, when people leave, when things fall apart, because you're no longer living in projections. You're responding to what is. This doesn't mean you abandon goals or let go of ambition. It means your foundation is here and now, not some imaginary version of yourself that exists after you fix everything. You realize the self you've been chasing isn't out there in the future. It's buried in the present, waiting to be uncovered, moment by moment, breath by breath. And so you ask, what part of this very moment am I still resisting? Because that's where your work begins. Not later, not eventually, now. You've returned to the present moment. Again and again, you've reminded yourself this is where life happens. But now you begin to notice something deeper, something always running quietly beneath the surface, like background music you didn't know was playing. It's the voice in your head, the narrator of your life, and for a long time, you've listened to it without question. It comments on everything. It judges, it rewinds scenes, and replays mistakes. It whispers, "You're not ready. They don't respect you. You'll always be this way." Sometimes it sounds like someone from your past. Sometimes it echoes the fears of the world around you, and sometimes you mistake it for truth simply because it's familiar. But if you are truly reinventing yourself quietly, steadily, like the Stoics, would you have to face this narrator? Because the stories you tell yourself shape the choices you make, and the choices you make shape the person you become. The Stoics weren't immune to this inner chatter. That's why they wrote, why they reflected, why they practiced turning inward, not to escape the world, but to examine the stories within. Epictetus put it simply, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. But reaction begins with interpretation, and interpretation is where the inner voice lives. So you begin to listen not with shame, but with curiosity. When something hard happens, what's your first internal sentence? When you succeed, do you allow yourself to feel it, or do you dismiss it with, "It's not enough"? When you imagine trying something new, what does the voice say? You start to see it clearly. Most of the time, your suffering doesn't come from the event itself. It comes from the story you wrapped around it. This isn't blame, it's awareness. Because here's the shift. Once you see the story, you can edit it, not with toxic positivity, not by pretending everything is fine, but by telling yourself something truer. So you begin to rewrite. A moment of failure no longer means I'm a failure. It becomes, that didn't work, but I'm learning. A moment of fear becomes, this is uncomfortable, but it's part of growth. The silence after a hard truth becomes, I said what needed to be said. Their reaction is not my responsibility. This isn't about lying to yourself. It's about liberating yourself from the falsehoods you've accepted without question. Think of your inner voice like a garden. For years, weeds have grown not because you're broken, but because no one taught you to tend the soil. Now, with awareness, you begin to pull. You plant new things. You water them with patience. And gradually, your mind becomes a place that supports your reinvention, not sabotages it. The Stoics used journaling as a tool for this. Nightly reflections, morning intentions, not for productivity, but for perspective. You try it too. A few lines in the evening. What did I do today that aligned with my values? Where did I let old stories take the wheel? What truth do I want to remember tomorrow? You don't need a perfect system. You need a mirror. And through this mirror, something starts to happen. The old voice doesn't disappear overnight, but its grip loosens, its volume drops, and in the space it once filled, something else emerges, a quieter voice, a steadier one. It doesn't scream, it doesn't flatter, it simply tells the truth. You handled that with grace. You can try again tomorrow. You're not who you were, and that's a good thing. You begin to realize you are always narrating your own life, and now you're learning to do it with care. So you ask yourself, if someone else spoke to me the way I speak to myself, would I trust them? And if the answer is no, you know where the next chapter of your reinvention begins. You've quieted your inner voice, or at least begun to speak back with clarity. And now you find yourself asking the most grounded question of all, how do I live this out daily? Because reinvention isn't just a mental shift. It's a lived one. Without structure, even the clearest intentions drift. Without rhythm, even the strongest values erode. The Stoics understood this in their bones. They didn't just preach philosophy, they practiced it every single day. Marcus Aurelius again and again wrote to himself about returning to what matters. He wasn't reminding others, he was reminding himself. He would wake and say, "Today I will meet people who are meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly," not out of pessimism, but out of preparation. He knew life's rhythms, so he built rituals to meet them, calmly, intentionally, with character. You start to see your life this way too, not just as a string of tasks or unpredictable events, but as a shape you are forming. And the shape is made of days. So you ask, what kind of day supports the person I'm becoming? You don't need a perfect schedule. You need a gentle structure, something steady enough to guide you, flexible enough to breathe. You start simple. A quiet moment in the morning before the world asks anything of you. No screen, just breath, or words, or silence. You don't need an hour. Even 5 minutes of undistracted presence becomes an anchor. Then you add intention. What one value do I want to embody today? Wisdom, patience, courage. Not all at once, just one. Lived in ordinary moments. You begin to pair your values with your actions. You eat not to punish or indulge, but to nourish. You move your body not to perform, but to strengthen. You speak not to impress, but to clarify. And in doing so, your day becomes less about what happens to you, and more about who you're practicing to be within it. You may design evening rituals too, a journal, a breath, a question. Where did I act from fear today? Where did I stay rooted in my principles? What do I want to try differently tomorrow? You begin to realize something powerful. Every day gives you dozens of chances to reinforce your identity or weaken it. Not in dramatic choices, but in quiet ones. You choose to respond instead of react. You choose to wait before judging. You choose to rise again after falling. And those choices compound like drops of water, wearing down stone. The Stoics would call this prohairesis, the faculty of choice, the core of moral character. They believe that what makes you who you are is not your status or even your talents, but your daily choices. So your calendar becomes more than time management. It becomes character management. And yet, you're gentle. When you fall short, and you don't collapse into shame. You simply return. That's what structure is for, not perfection, but return. You begin to see your daily structure not as a cage, but as a garden trellis, a quiet support system that helps you grow towards the sun. It holds your shape when you feel lost. It reminds you who you're trying to be when everything outside feels chaotic, and soon others begin to notice something. Not your routines, necessarily, but your energy. You're more grounded, less reactive, more intentional in your speech, more present in your attention. They don't see the structure, but they feel its effects. Because when you shape your days with care, your life shapes itself with meaning. You ask, what does my current daily rhythm say about what I value, and what kind of person is this rhythm slowly creating? If the answers don't match who you want to become, you have your next step. Not a revolution, a revision. One block of time, one routine, one breath at a time. This is how you reinvent yourself. Without theatrics, you don't announce the new self. You live into it. By now, something has shifted. You've laid down the foundation: clarity, detachment, presence, intention. You've learned to steer your days with structure and your thoughts with care. But a question begins to emerge. Not from the mind, but from the soul. What is this all for? Because no matter how grounded you become, something still feels incomplete when reinvention is only inward. The Stoics knew this too. They were not monks, they were leaders, advisors, citizens. Their philosophy was not only for self-mastery, it was also for service. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire. Epictetus taught students. Seneca advised emperors. And each, in their own way, saw personal virtue not as the end, but as the means to contribute something to the whole. You start to see it too. The self you're becoming isn't just for you, it's for the people around you, the ones you speak to, the ones you raise, the ones you influence, without even realizing it. Reinvention becomes most meaningful when it touches something beyond your own reflection. And so you begin to ask gently, who benefits when I become more grounded? You realize that every act of inner stillness creates outer ripples. When you learn patience, you parent differently. When you master your temper, your relationships soften. When you pursue your work with purpose, it lifts others too. Even your presence, your calm, your steadiness becomes a kind of quiet leadership in a world that's always speeding up. This is justice as the Stoics defined it. Not just fairness, but contribution. Seneca once wrote, "Wherever there is a human being, there is an opportunity for kindness." You realize that you've been given this life, this opportunity to rebuild, not only to enjoy it, but to offer it. Not in grand gestures. You don't have to start a movement or save the world, but in the small, often invisible ways you show up. A word of encouragement when someone is doubting themselves, a steady voice in a room full of noise, a generous silence when someone just needs space. Even your suffering, if carried with grace, can serve. It becomes a kind of testimony. It's possible to hurt and still act with dignity. It's possible to fall and still choose kindness. And in time, this changes how you view your entire journey. Reinvention is no longer about fixing yourself. It's about preparing yourself so you can serve with clarity, offer presence, and live with intention in a world that desperately needs more of it. You shift from asking, "What do I want to become?" to asking, "Who needs me to become this?" That doesn't mean you disappear. It means you expand. You no longer live only for pleasure or comfort. You live for contribution, however small, however humble. You might still have dreams. You might still want beauty, success, adventure. That's okay. Stoicism never asked you to reject joy. It simply asked you to root it in something deeper than self-interest. So your reinvention takes on a kind of quiet nobility. You build strength not to dominate, but to protect. You seek wisdom not to appear wise, but to guide. You practice discipline not for praise, but to be reliable. And in that, something sacred happens. You stop chasing meaning, you start creating it. You begin to see that the greatest reward for becoming your best self is that you finally have something valuable to give. Even your presence, your calmness, your steadiness becomes a refuge for others. You realize this is the Stoic way, to carry the weight of life with courage, to face suffering with dignity, to live not for applause, but for alignment, and to use every step of your personal journey as an offering to the world around you. So now you ask, who am I becoming? Not just for myself, but for others, because when your reinvention serves something larger, it doesn't end with you. It continues in actions, in influence, in quiet legacies you'll never fully see. And now, you reach the edge of this journey, but not the end. Because if the Stoics taught you anything, it's this: there is no final version of you, no destination, no arrival that closes the book with a triumphant thud. Instead, there is this moment, and then the next, a continual unfolding, a steady becoming. You pause here, not to summarize, but to breathe, to acknowledge how far you've come, not in miles traveled, but in awareness deepened, in stories rewritten, in choices reclaimed. You understand now. Reinventing yourself isn't about becoming someone else. It's about returning to the quiet truth of who you've always been, under the noise, under the fear, under the pressure, a being capable of wisdom, courage, balance, and justice. A person shaped by presence, not perfection. A soul that finds strength not in control, but in clarity. The Stoics never promised ease, but they did promise this: if you choose to live deliberately, life will meet you with its own kind of grace. You won't always get it right. You'll forget. You'll react. You'll fall back into old habits. But now, you know you can return, always, to your breath, to your values, to this one moment, lived fully. So you leave this reflection with no dramatic vows, just a quiet intention to keep showing up, to keep choosing, to keep coming, and maybe, along the way, you help someone else find their way too, not by telling them who to be, but by being someone real in front of them. That is the Stoic way. And now, it's yours too.